use some terminology consistently so that when we use the word, we're all meaning the same thing. And try to organize this enormous amount of information in this very, very complicated field of practice. And I want to start really, really big by looking at all children, all families, all needs. We have to decide for ourselves how we're going to narrow that so we can be effective, which means that different programs and different organizations may select a subgroup of this whole and do special programming for that group of people. But again, to do that, we need to understand the whole first. All right, so I'm laying out the big picture. I want to make sure that we're all starting on the same page. I'm making an assumption that family-based care for vulnerable children is our mission. That's why we're all here. All right? That means we're working with children who are either not able to stay in their families or are already out of their families. Right? So when we talk about vulnerable children, we're talking about children who are vulnerable to being separated either temporarily or permanently from their families. There are lots of other reasons that children can be very vulnerable. They can be very vulnerable because of war, of disease, of auto accidents. Okay, there's all kinds of things. But our narrower focus is children who need family-based care who don't have it. All right. So there are a lot, and you've talked about many of these. There are a lot of things happening in the world that are really positive, but that also create some problems for us. So everybody's been really, really excellent at advocating that children need to be in families. And many people around the world get it. In order to respond to that, they're saying, okay, then let's close institutions and put children into families. Logically, it makes sense. But if you really understand the dynamics, that really can place children at greater risk of harm. Because what you do is you push children who've already been, and I'm not telling you what, you already all know this. This is not new information for you. I'm just trying to build it into this whole picture. You take children who've already been traumatized and they have developmental delays and deep needs because of their experiences. And you put them in families that are completely unprepared to deal with them. And especially, I mean, think about, you were talking about, Maria was talking about a program at lunch of new parents who simply, the family falls apart because the parents aren't getting any sleep. So think about families that are taking in children. They naturally expect them to be just like all the other children that they've dealt with. But these children are different. They're not different because they're different. They're different because of their experiences, because they've been traumatized and all the developmental issues that go along with that. I'm seeing a lot of systems acting as if foster care is the answer. All right, now foster care is one answer for some children for some period of time. This is where our experience in the United States and Canada can be helpful, because we also deinstitutionalized back in the 1970s. And we put a lot of kids into foster care rather than children's homes. We also did this with our population of mentally ill adults and people with developmental disabilities. And we did not prepare communities. We did not put in sufficient services. We thought we've deinstitutionalized, we're home free, we're good. And 30 years later, we have children who have grown up in foster care, some of them in many placements, not one. They go in with the idea that it's going to be till they're 18, but their challenges and their issues make it difficult for foster parents. And because there's no legal or emotional permanent commitment to those children, the placements disrupt, which means one day the social worker gets a call, my husband had a heart attack, I can't care for this child anymore, and the kid goes somewhere else. We are now dealing with the legacy of all kinds of kids who have grown up in foster care. They're not prepared to emancipate. They don't have permanent family connections. We want independent living, but who of us lives independently? We're all connected and integrated, and if we're not, we're clinically depressed and at a lot of risk for mental illness. So we've really failed a lot of these kids because we've not given them permanent. Permanent doesn't mean till 18 or 21. Permanent means permanent as long as you're alive. We've not given them permanent family connections, which is something that each one of us understands is not only valuable, but essential to our well-being and our mental health. The other issue is that we deinstitutionalized our folks with developmental disabilities. We put them in group homes and communities, oftentimes without preparing those communities. And most of our homeless, and we've got an increasing population in this country of homeless adults, and a very high percentage of them are mentally ill because there are not community services to support them or to keep them in, keep them stable in families. So deinstitutionalization, people are seeing it as the desired end. The goal is deinstitutionalization. In the best circumstance, it's a means to an end. And the end is that people living in institutions will now live in families and communities. But nobody's figured out how to get from A to B. And the problem is that if we don't build the service system, and I've heard a lot of you say that, if we don't build the service system in communities that makes it possible for our kids to get reintegrated and stay there. That's the kicker. They can get reintegrated, but they have to stay there. They have to be healthy there, and they have to, their well-being is very important. We don't do that. We're going to have hordes of kids back on the streets, or worse, from my perspective, is that they will bounce out of their families. The government will say, see, I told you these kids can't live in families. And that will be the end of deinstitutionalization because the people that built that system in the first place thought it was the right thing to do. And this will just reaffirm, we're all bleeding hearts trying to do this, but it's impossible. These children don't belong here. They're damaged. They're whatever. Okay. So the issue for me is how we put the brakes on this wholesale deinstitutionalization long enough so that we can put in the supports that are necessary in order for those children to be able to be reintegrated into families, preferably permanent families, or at least with permanent family connections. And when you look at it that way, it becomes this overwhelming problem that you're likely to say, where do we even start? Okay. So I'm raising this because what I don't want to see happen is other countries go down the same road that we did, thinking you were doing the right thing. And pardon my language, but 5-10 years out down the road say, shit, what did we just do? Right? You need to understand what the possible liabilities are and what has to happen in order for this to really be in children's best interests. I do want to clarify some terminology. Permanent family connections can be adoption, but it can also be reintegration into one's own family. And that doesn't necessarily mean their parents. It can be with siblings. It can be with extended family. Or it can be families, I think in many ways, Alex, like what you're doing with the 3 kids in the orphanage, whether they're adopted or not. There is a family that they are psychologically a part of, even if they don't live there full time. So there are lots and lots of models. This is one of the areas where churches can be really, really valuable, especially for emancipating kids, if they're willing to make a permanent commitment to be a family for those kids, even if there's never any legal agreement to it. It's not, I will mentor this child for a year, I will have done my thing, he's now independent. There have actually been testimonies of children who have come out of foster care who have said that their affiliation with their church is what's kept them going. Because it's not one family, but it's a whole network of people. Friends, somewhere to go when they have trouble, places to go for holidays, and being encompassed in this kind of permanent network ongoing has given them the emotional connections they need to make it independently. So permanent family connections can mean many different things. There are many different models. And in those countries where legal adoption is not favored or not allowed, that doesn't mean that you can't set up permanent family connections. You can. And it'll be different for each child. So I think what I'm trying to say is I want us to be really careful that we don't jump to oversimple solutions for what are extremely complicated problems, right? We need to start by understanding the complexity and try to make some sense out of it. All right. So how do we do this? So several years ago, Ruby and I were having a conversation about the public child protection system, because that's where we've done most of our work over the years, which means that we're dealing with children who've already been abused and neglected. And it's our job to figure out what we can do to fix what's wrong and keep it from happening again. And in the entire dialogue about this, this whole contingent of people who are saying prevent it, start early. Don't do it down here, but do it up there. And Ruby uses the example of upriver, downriver, which I'm sure you've probably shared with all these folks, don't you? Maybe. So we're down here at the end of the line. These kids have been thrown into the river for one reason or another, and we're pulling them out, trying to figure out how to give them, how to make them healthy again. And the question is, can we go farther upriver and keep people from throwing kids in the first place? That makes perfect logical sense. But I will tell you that the technology to know which children are going to get tossed and which aren't, we don't have that technology in this world yet. We can't, we're not clairvoyant. We can't predict. We can guess based on some family factors, and that's what we're going to talk about here. But I think the statistics show that this is a research term, the base rate, in other words, the percentage of children from the total population who are abused or neglected enough, they come to the attention of a Child Protective Services agency. It's really pretty small. If you're looking at the entire population, most families in their communities do well enough that their kids grow up reasonably healthy and, become functioning adults. It would be perfect if we could look at any family and say, this one, if we don't do something, that kid's going to end up in the river. But we don't have that ability. So because we can't do that, we either have to have full services for everybody in the entire community. And there is not a country in this world that has a budget that would be able to support that to the level that it needs to be supported, unless we completely obliterated all of our defense monies, which would be lovely, but I don't think anybody's going to do that. So we're going to always, even with the best of intentions and the best of programs, we're always going to be pulling kids out. There will always be kids that will need help further down the line. So we have to be prepared and know what we have to do at each level. And so part of what I've just given you is an attempt to fill in this empty hole between an understanding that we need to provide services, we need to do family-based care for these kids, and having all of these kids in family-based care. How do you get from here to here? And I think all the work that yes.
So how do we get from here to here?
Yes.
We are at the end of the river.
No. We have already agreed that children belong in families.
Yes.
Okay? How do we get to a point where all these children are in families? All right? Something has to happen in between to get us there. We can't just say, okay, kids. All right? Yeah. Here's families, go pick one, see ya. And that is what I call the black hole, because we don't know how to do that. We don't have a clear idea of how we take all these kids. We don't have infrastructures. We don't have funding. We don't have program. We don't have people with the training to deal with their special needs. It feels it's an insurmountable, I'm using all these words, it feels like it's an impossible task. And what each one of us does is a piece of it. Okay? So what I want to do is look at this whole idea of where families fit on a continuum and look at what kinds of things in general have to be in place in communities and societies in order for us to achieve this goal. Okay? So the chart was my attempt to take what's in my head after 45 years in this field and put it down in a way that it will make sense to other people, that other people can see it. And so I used it in a training and showed it to Ruby, and she said, laminate it, all right? And give it to everybody. I said, let me write it so it's neater. It's pretty messy. Ruby said, laminate it. So what you have is that, and I hope you can read my writing, but let me go through it and explain to you what this is intending to do. All right, so you're going to see on the left side, actually, I need mine too. It's there.
Yes. It's theirs to keep, right?
Yeah. And I have a couple more. Is anybody sharing them?
Does everybody have one?
You all have one? I think I brought enough, but okay. All right.
Leslie, you have one back in the back to look at?
They're sharing for right now, but you can, yeah, I've got.
It's fine.
Okay. So the reason that I said, which vulnerable children are we working with? Would you guys, here,
Well, I was looking. I didn't see any.
I don't know where I put them either.
Anybody see any laminated rolled up items?
I think I'm losing it.
How many did you bring, Judy?
12. Are there more in there? Huh?
Because this is number 12 back here.
All right,
There's 11,
okay.
so they're all out.
all right, good, okay. All right, so let's talk about prevention because we really want to prevent kids from coming out of families, okay? When you look at, and how many of you know the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention? Is this something that you don't know because you don't know the words? All right. Primary prevention means that you're preventing an outcome for everybody, right? So an example of primary prevention is putting seat belts in cars because that's intended to save lives of everybody in a society that drives in a car, okay? Immunizations, universal immunizations for all children is primary prevention to prevent illness in everybody, okay? I think the closest social programs, and Maria, you can help me, the closest we've come as a world to primary prevention for children is the model in Sweden, where they collected enough tax money so that they have universal services for every child in every family across a broad spectrum of services. The benefit to that is that you can prevent a lot of family disruptions. The problem is that it is very expensive. And you're providing services. Now, this is the question. It's expensive. We don't know if it's more expensive than all the back end. That's what the childonomics is trying to determine. It may ultimately be the same amount of money.
Plus, it's less stigmatizing than any time.
Right, exactly. All right. So there's lots of reasons, but from a policymaker's perspective, it's way more expensive to provide services to all families than it is to just the families who need it. Because the truth is, most families will never disrupt. Most families will not abuse their children. Most families will not neglect their children, okay? So the society has to make a decision about what they're going to spend on primary prevention for everybody. So we can keep children in families in a smaller group, okay? As you move down the line, there is a group of families, and understand, I'm taking what is a continuum and making it into categories, and it's not clean, it doesn't work exactly, but this is to just give you points on a continuum. Secondary prevention means that you've identified a reason that some children are at higher risk of not being able to live in their families. They're either higher risk of abuse or higher risk of neglect, higher risk of abandonment. So you've taken this huge group of everybody in society and you've narrowed it down to a smaller subgroup and these, I hear people call them at-risk families. In Ukraine, they call them crisis families. But what they mean is that they're families who are already showing some level of problems that would mean their children are more vulnerable. Okay? But so far, the children are still in their families. They're not abused and they're not neglected. The theory is if you put resources in to those families, you can often stabilize them and those children can stay at home. All right? That's the second level of prevention, and it's called secondary, means just the second level of prevention. Right? The third level of prevention is for families that are already disrupted. The children are already out of their families, or the kids are abused and neglected. And people say, well, you're already past the point of prevention, but your purpose is to prevent it from happening again, or prevent it from continuing for a long period of time. So even in very difficult circumstances, prevention still matters. And you want to focus your work. If the child has been abused, you want to prevent him from being abused another time, so that you're actually stopping this process. So conceptually, yes, were you going to ask something?
Yeah, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
In Brazil, when we talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, they make the difference between secondary and tertiary when the kids are not with the family anymore.
Okay.
Is it the same? We're talking about that?
That's correct. It depends on what you're trying to prevent.
Okay.
All right. If you're trying to prevent disruption, then yeah, children who are out of their homes would be tertiary. I also have another objective, and that's I want to prevent abuse. I want to prevent neglect. Okay. And there are children who have been somehow harmed, and I want to prevent it from happening again. The reason let me jump ahead for a minute. The reason I'm focusing on this has been another fear of mine. When you look at the whole continuum of child welfare services, by the time a child comes out of their family, there's already, there's a lot of trauma, but the trauma can be from prior maltreatment. There are all these issues that have led the child to this place. In working with people, it feels to me as if their focus is on family-based placement and they're finished. Okay? My question is, so you can take all of these kids and get them into family-based placements. How are you going to prevent other children coming in? And why do they come in? Well, some of them come in because they've been abandoned, and some of them come in because they've been abused, and some of them come in because they've been neglected. All right, great. How are you going to know the difference? How do you know whether a child has been abused enough that they need to come into care? Even though conceptually we're starting with the child placement part of the child welfare continuum, if we do it right, we are going to back ourselves right into primary work on child maltreatment, recognizing abuse, recognizing neglect, recognizing sexual abuse. What does drug use do in terms of family dynamics? Rather than backing into it, I'd like it to be at the forefront now, because often this is what's driving the family disruption in the first place. And we need to be thinking about that, even if we're only working right now on child placement. We have to be thinking about the whole rest of the continuum, so we're not going to be surprised when we run into it. Okay? Which is part of why Child Protective Services has to be part of this whole conversation about family-based placement and care. So when I say secondary prevention, I'm talking about preventing abandonment and out-of-home placement, but I'm also talking about maltreatment. And you can put anything you want in there if your mission is to avoid that. Okay? All right. Once you have children who have been abused, neglected, abandoned, all the rest of that, you have to provide services to not only remedy it, to keep children safe, but also to make sure that they stay that way. So the question on the table was, are these really three separate groups of people? Or is it a continuum, the same families at different points in time? And can a family become at risk when they weren't before? The answer is of course. Can a family that's never abused abuse? Of course, depending on changes in circumstances. So when we talk about services, what kind of services do we need? We have to figure out what kinds of help would be most likely needed at different points on this continuum. So if you look at the primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, Karen, are you frozen? Did you put the sweater on?
It's
You remember?
right.
Go ahead, put it on if you want, yeah. If you look at the services, you'll find that they become more specialized as you go from general down to much more specific. So core services are the prevention services that all families should have: access to health care, access to education, access to parent support, economic support. I mean, you're basically building an environment in which families can get their needs met and function well enough, they're stable enough that they can give their children what they need. When you start looking at secondary prevention, you have families who, even with all of that, have greater needs or greater problems. And that may be because they're economically vulnerable. It may mean that there's a mentally ill parent. They may be using some kind of substance. It could be as simple as that they have to go to another community to work and they have no place to leave their children. There are factors that, for why they're at risk. And so if you look at those services, it's going to cover all the human needs: health needs, food needs, education, counseling, drug, alcohol treatment, inclusive access to education for their children. In Ukraine, a lot of the kids are in orphanages because their parents think they're going to get a better education there, because they can't, and that may be true for some of you also. So it's well-meaning, but it's actually problematic because the children should have inclusive education in their own communities. And what's interesting is that when you're looking at tertiary prevention, it's not a different set of services. It's the same services that are needed by families at risk. So you build it once and it is appropriate for both, for families in both of those categories. The difference is, for child protection, you have another issue, and that is that you have to be sure that the children will be safe because there's some risk that their families will harm them. That's what makes it a child protection situation as opposed to a family support situation. So there are situations in which you have parents, for example. Our biggest challenge here in Ohio now is we have lots more people who are overdosing, who are addicted and overdosing on opiates, on painkiller medications, and the other stuff that's being brought in, the fentanyl and heroin. I mean, the really big drugs that kill people. And our foster care numbers have been going down for about 10, 15 years because we were doing so many family-based placements. And they've skyrocketed again because there are so many children who are coming out of families where drug addiction has made the parents really dangerous for their children. There are parents that make methamphetamines in their bathtubs. And imagine, it's not just kids aren't being cared for, but they get in contact with the drugs. We have a lot of children that are being born addicted. Okay? So you have a mentally ill parent that absolutely is out of it. and has a 2-year-old, that child is really in serious danger in the care of that parent. Okay? So you have to have an additional layer of protection, which means if I can do everything possible to help support that family and that child is still not safe, I have to do something. I'm compelled to act to protect that child. And you don't want to do that if you can work collaboratively with the family and support the family. But there will be times when you need that extra layer of child protective services, which is the bottom part of this. But you don't bring those to bear unless everything else fails and you can't keep the children safe by putting all of these other services in. So that's the paradigm, because your programming is not going to work for everybody. You have to decide where you fit here. What is your program aiming to do? You may do some things for one group and some things for another group, but part of this will help you decide who you're working with. It will help you assess what the needs are, and it'll help you determine what other service people might need that you're not providing, but you might be able to get someone else or another NGO to provide for them. So, and this breaks it out, for each of these, who are the possible service providers? And the service providers can be anybody on the continuum, with the exception of child protection, which almost always, by definition, must be a government function, because you are, at least in our system, you are depriving parents of their inherent rights to raise their children in the way that they see fit, which is a fundamental right in our Constitution. And it's hopefully a fundamental right of all parents all around the world. And the only way that you can intervene to remove those rights is if they're putting their children at serious danger and can't or won't do anything to fix that. So you have to have a legal system that backs you up. You have to have protections for the people that are doing the work. You have to have the ability to go to court, potentially to terminate rights. So it's a subsection under all of this. And in many of the cases, you will not need that, but there will be some where you will be working with those folks because of the nature of this. Any questions or discussion before we go over to the last column? Does this tell you anything? Does anything come to mind that
Karen has
Oh, Karen, I'm sorry.
I see how important the legal system is, but in India, we don't have a backing like that, or we don't have child protection services. We have that gap, and I don't see it filled anytime soon. So how do we do something without the support of the government?
I don't know.
That's an important question.
Yeah, actually, the other way to see it, as I was just thinking about, actually having one African village that's ruled by a chief.
Yes.
I mean, see, I think some of the problems that we're discussing now comes with more of urbanization, with more, I mean, the way society structure changed. So I think I share what Karen's saying, like some of the services we're not going to get from the government.
Right. That's right.
But is there an alternative way where, I mean, the community can actually step in? And I mean, we never had orphanages till orphans actually before we started orphanages. The society has a mechanism that can actually absorb. So one thing we need to actually try to understand and cultivate is that we shouldn't lose some of our values in that society. That actually, for instance, family issues have always been dealt with. Like there are communities.
Right.
we can encourage church to get involved and handle those issues. And I can be biased, but um, most of us, I think, in the other side, don't trust our government or a government
They don't
system.
trust the government here either.
Yeah, I think the system has its own challenge.
Yeah.
So I would rather prefer like alternative community based. Is
So would I. I'm gonna ask you, I can be very provocative. You know what that word means?
yes,
Are you aware of the child sexual abuse that's happened in every community in every country at some point?
Yeah.
Did anybody even know it was
Mhm.
happening? And what happened with it?
yes,
Okay?
yeah.
I mean, so that's, have there been times when families or communities use punishment that
Mhm.
you would think is seriously damaging to children?
I completely agree.
So
I,
it's an ethical issue. And I
Mhm.
mean, it really is an ethical issue. At what point
Mhm.
communities step in and take away a parent's right to raise
Mhm.
their own children the way they want to? What is the community going to allow? And when is the community going to say, that's enough? All right? That has to be decided
Mhm.
based on community standards. But hopefully there's a universal understanding that some behaviors are damaging to all children, even if their communities say, we've done this for generations and it's okay. So that's an ethical question. All I'm saying, and I'm not suggesting that we're going to fix that here. All I'm saying is that we need to keep this in the backs of our
Mhm.
minds. And when we're doing our planning, we have to know when something is going to require a different kind of intervention than what's going to work for it. All right? And it may be that for right now, we're going to work primarily, and I think this is probably the place until Maria can and Childonomics can convince people in levels of government that it's economically more sound to work up here. We don't want to wait
Yeah.
until they're down here. That's our targets.
Can I say something?
Yes,
May I
Maria's been
ask
wanting to say
something. Because I guess it is extremely important today that the communities have got a value system, so and also there are traditions and cultural imprintings. My question would be to you, because it really is interesting for me how to tackle that. What is the perception of the given communities in your cases? Whether they have a right and obligation to intervene or not, or relying on outside interventions, because that's also something we have to consider when we are planning or doing things. So whose business is it on the one hand? On the other hand, whether there is a kind of commitment and agreement who is doing what.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, the first one. Would you mind if I stand the rest of the discussion?
No, I don't mind at all.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's fine.
Okay. I think
Get up, move around, whatever you want to
Yeah.
do.
the way I see, I understand culture, especially in our context. There are some things that need to be changed, and we have to challenge the society. And there are some things that we need to actually nurture, so that we won't lose in the name of civilization or modernization.
Progress.
So that's my fear. And even when we think about intervention, would it be preferable for to actually, for instance, create awareness about commitment and even about dignity? I mean, for me, it revolves about treating children as a dignified human beings. Especially that's true in our African culture, because it takes certain age actually for you to be considered full human being.
Mm.
And most of the negative, the evils actually arise because of that attitude. So should we start challenging the community, or should we have a government institution to handle that? For me, way of intervention should be somewhere at a local level, at a practical level, where we don't have that much money actually invested in it. Just utilizing what you have at the grassroots.
I want to make something really clear. I'm not advocating for government intervention. That is absolutely the last thing you do. Only for, hopefully, if everything else is working, that's only the worst, most egregious cases. Someone that's got a mental health diagnosis and actually tortures a child. We had a case in Ohio where a family adopted 13 children and kept them in cages.
Wow.
Okay? That needed government. All right? So if we can build a system exactly the way you're talking about, we want to divert families and kids out of this every place possible. In a perfect world, we'd never go to a government intervene. Okay, so I agree with you. You do everything you can to build the community's awareness.
Yeah, if I may also give 2 examples, and I would really love to understand what is your approach. For instance, there are instances in a community where people assume someone is pregnant. He wants to hide the pregnancy. And the question is, has the community or anyone in the community, have they got the right to intervene and say that perhaps you are in a trouble because you don't want to admit that you are expecting a baby, for instance, an unmarried single person or a young girl. So these are the questions where, for me, where it is interesting. It's not an authoritarian intervention. The question is, what about the neighbors? What about the schoolmates or whoever can just be suspicious, but they don't want to intervene because it's not pleasant? Or so my question is there a kind of obligation on our behalf, professionals, encouraging the community to make steps in these cases? The other question is obviously when this is an intervention into the privacy of a family. So and what makes the difference? Or in the case of Ethiopia or other countries, if we are looking, for instance, female genital mutilation,
That's
difficult question. When there should be a clear prohibition and steps taken to prevent it, but culturally it's very embedded, and there is a strong community support. So what I'm trying to ask, what makes the difference, and how can we differentiate between the different kind of things when we are advocating for intervention, non-intervention, or what?
Well, you're talking fundamental children's rights, which are a part of human rights, which are certainly not completely figured out. That's the context in which we're working. Yeah. Alex, you had a thought. Go ahead. Can you hold your thought?
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say exactly like that. Of course, when we think about the universal children's rights, it's very clear that society has its duty, right? But I don't think people. No, I think it's only on the paper, and people really prefer not to get involved. And I think this is one of our main roles. And I believe all of us we have many possibilities to talk to the communities, right? But on the other hand, I think sometimes we're very romantic about our own communities. And for example, if we are Christians, we think that the Christian community is ready to receive this message and to protect. And then we get really frustrated when we see that we place children in Christian families and they are still abused, they're still suffering from violence and so on. So it's really complex, and we really need to be aware of that.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's true.
Yeah,
Alex?
and actually, probably on the same complexity, another example was a Romanian family, Christians, or travel to Norway, probably you know about the case.
Exactly.
They believe in spanking children, and Norwegian government took the children. Well, in the country, the whole population was against. We have people in the streets, probably in every city in Romania, asking, putting pressure on Norwegian government to give the children back. And in the end, they give the children back. And I'm not saying
That's a
any,
very good example.
I'm not saying my opinion, but I'm saying different communities relate to the same incident
Yeah,
differently.
but Alex, this is the question. So if there is a ban on corporal punishment, which is, I would agree, everywhere, then the question is, how are you preparing the parents to learn alternative techniques, one, and second, in this case, I don't know whether you've heard about this case. This was a really exploding crisis.
Mhm.
That the Norwegian social workers were not sensitive to understand these families' cultural background, understanding of smacking, and so on. Moreover, they were prohibiting them to speak in Romanian with the kids, which was quite bizarre, and also separated the 5 children and placed them into different families. So this was, I guess, a system abuse case
and
on
they were,
behalf of the Norwegian child protection
and they
system.
were planning to give adoption very fast, which
Yeah.
I didn't
They
understand.
immediately placed the children out of the family. So this is what Judy was trying to say, that we have to be very careful and looking at the different stages of intervention, if any, and first starting with support. And interestingly enough, what I see now that in the international new jargon, they don't even say primary or early intervention, they say early support to avoid the word intervention, because what we want to do is supporting and not intervening. And that is, but it goes still back to this question, I guess. What is the role of the community and the responsibility, and whether we are accountable as a neighbor, as someone, as a teacher, to do something.
But even in that case, you somehow highlight the problem with the Norwegian part, but also I'm not sure even about the Romanian part, because everybody was, how can they take the children? But they didn't know. We didn't know exactly how bad they were spanking, or so we just wanted to support because they are.
No, but it has become a kind of cultural, I mean, whatever, freedom fight.
Yes.
So I can tell you what we
I was just going to mention that in Brazil, a big issue that we have is about homosexuality. Okay, because homosexual families, they have the right to adopt, and the kids, they have the right of following their own way. So we've been having a lot of problems with, for example, Christians that they don't accept at all, the homosexuals to adopt, but they don't adopt. So let's leave the kids in institutions forever. Or Christians that want to foster or adopt kids, but then if this kid becomes a homosexual, then they can't stand that, and they return the kid to institution. Okay, so it's just to bring an example of how complex these things are.
What I was going to say is I really have been in this field almost for 50 years, because I started very young doing this kind of work as a volunteer before I was employed. And I'm old enough now that I can say, a clock has what's called a pendulum, the tick-tock kind of thing.
In and out.
It goes from here to here to here in 10-year cycles. Child's rights advocates take the children, give the children what they need, whatever. And then the other side, family rights advocates say, you can't do that. You're violating the rights of families. Keep all children in their families, regardless of what happens. Provide the services. Either one, if you leave a child in the family and the child is harmed, the community says, it's your responsibility to take the children out and protect them. You take children out and protect them, and the community says, you're child stealers. You're taking children away from their families. In my lifetime, this has not changed. I suspect in our lifetimes, it will not
Yeah.
change. So we have to be intelligent enough to know how to stop it in the middle and to make the decision based on the individual circumstances of each child and family. And thank you for leading me there, because it's one more concept I want to teach you, and then we're going to take a quick
Okay,
break
can I
and
say
go
something
into.
before you go there?
Yeah.
I want to go back to your question, Karen, and I'm looking at that from a very practical piece. And where do I go if we don't have a child protective service? And I think a lot of what I've heard being said here, it brings us to the place of recognizing a responsibility we have. We need to know what resources and services we can go to. I absolutely appreciate some of the conversation looking at the culture within a community and knowing what it is. Is it a large potential resource available, or is there a small network of resource available that will help us if we don't have child protection or we don't have police? In India and in some of the other countries we work with, the go-to place in lieu of child protective services are the police. If that's who's there to do whatever. Do they do a good job, bad job? That's for you to determine in terms of your own community. What I see as bottom line here, and this is what I think is a takeaway, and I don't know if you see this, but I see this as a takeaway. If we, as an NGO in a country, are hoping to serve children and serve families well, we need to understand this chart from the conceptual point of looking at what is happening at the primary, at the secondary, tertiary, looking at as well, what are the things that need to be in place? What is my role, just as Judy said? And then thirdly, what are my resources out there to help me in each of these particular areas? And culturally, knowing your countries, I see those different resources you have in different places. In Ethiopia, you have resources maybe in Addis that we won't have in North Ethiopia, for example. So it is even within your country, it's going to be different. So NGO to NGO, program to program, if we're not doing our responsibility, looking at this from a conceptual standpoint and saying, okay, let's put it together in my mind. We're actually going to go there in a little bit. And what does it mean to me in my country? And what are the resources? It was a great conversation, but there's a really good takeaway here. Grab it.
Yeah, it also takes us to the fourth column, because this is the whole between, okay, we need services, let's build services, but there's a whole middle piece here, and that's called infrastructure, that people tend to forget about. If you want services to be implemented, you have to have money, some money, you have to have people, they have to know what they're doing, they have to have the resources to be able to do it. You have to have an administrative structure that holds it together. You need policies, you need laws, you need procedures, you need evaluation strategies. It needs to be partnerships between organizations so you're not wasting resources with everybody doing the same thing and spending money 3 times to do what you could do once. It involves, anyway, it's all listed, because this column, how these are organized, is the work that we need to be doing collectively to get from an understanding of what we want to happen and actually making it happen. And some of you may be way down the road on this. Those of you already run organizations, you've got infrastructure, and you know how important or necessary it is to have that. There are ways that you can strengthen your infrastructure. There are things you can put in place to sustain your infrastructure. But for me, in listening to people trying to solve this problem, that's the black hole, is that they somehow don't have a precedent or don't have a clear understanding of how you build the right infrastructure to put in services. I can give you an example from Ukraine. They've decided to decentralize and to put money down at the regional level for services. But they don't know how to move from there. What am I buying with this money? and they don't have a concept of how to build a system. It's a training need. It's something that we need to be able to help communities understand how to build an organization. And it doesn't mean an organization like a building or an agency. How do you organize this at a local level so that it actually can work? Okay, so that's another conversation for another day, but that's the chart. Yeah.
And this is a really good point. You remember your mother's always telling you, "I told you so." This is an "I told you so" moment. This is one of the values of doing assessment, of doing even the environmental assessment. Remember, we've talked so much about it, and I told you we've gotten some pushback. Why are we going to do this? Well, you did a piece of environmental assessment and gave you great information. But there are other things that we can gather from a community that help us to know how to begin to strengthen and build from where we are. It's all about being willing to do that assessment work. Anyway, that's my "I told you so."
Okay, right.
I love it.
Last paradigm, and this is so that that as we're talking, crisis families, at-risk families, we all think we know we're talking about the same thing. I want to make sure that we are, okay? The word risk in English, is there an equivalent word in all your languages for risk?
Risk. Risk.
Risk.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's a little bit complicated. For all of us, it says there's a potential danger. Something could happen. All right. A risk means that there's a chance, there's a likelihood, there's a possibility of something happening that we would like to avoid. All right? That's what the word risk means. It's that simple. For our purposes, we have to define it. Risk of what? There's some risk that my daughter will get married before she finishes high school. I mean, I don't have a daughter, but that, you could use the word in that way. There's increased risk of a traffic accident when there's ice on the road, right? So when we talk about at-risk families, we have to define at-risk